Thank you for coming all today. So as Alicia mentioned, I'm a project officer in the illegal dumping team at the EPA. The illegal dumping team's role is to design and deliver strategic programs to reduce and prevent illegal dumping to help achieve a 30% reduction in illegal dumping incidents by 2020. So to give you some context around this presentation today, one of our targets is to reduce household waste dumping. So 47% of illegal dumping incidents in New South Wales involve household waste, and the majority of those occur on the curb or roadside. So targeting this specific type of behaviour is a major objective for the illegal dumping team. So to help us inform programs to prevent this type of dumping, we wanted to get a better understanding of the behaviours that are driving that dumping. So our first step was to commission social research to go into a deeper dive into the motivations, knowledge, attitudes and behaviours around illegal dumping, as well as the physical, social factors that are driving this behaviour to help design those programs. So in this presentation this morning, I'll go through the research design, the research findings and the recommendations from that research and the EPA's next steps in this space. And throughout the rest of this session, I'm going to be followed by some amazing presenters from Council who've done some wonderful projects in this space. So it all ties together really nicely and I hope you enjoy. So, understanding curbside dumping. So we went into the research project and we engaged Ipsos Social Research Institute to undertake the research for us with two key research questions. Why do people dump waste on the curb? And how can we change this behaviour? So we kept it quite simple and targeted, and we wanted to make sure our research design was qualitative to start with, to help build insights to develop the program, and then to go out further into quantitative as the program progressed. So this research is very much deep dive qualitative stuff. So we used social research to answer these questions. So the research design. We had 8 depth interviews with council waste managers about their knowledge of curbside campaigns that they had run and their experience of their effectiveness. And then we did 8 depth interviews with real estate agents and strata managers to understand their relationship with curbside dumping and what might motivate them to engage with prevention. And then we did 7 group discussions with people who both identified as curbside dumpers and identified as other residents, to go into that much more detailed information about what was driving the behaviour. So, summary of findings. Curbside disposal is seen as normal, free, easy and positive. Most people in New South Wales have put waste on the curb in a way that would be considered curbside dumping at some point, often repeatedly. What is socially or legally acceptable is very unclear, so there was a lot of ambiguity in the research participants' minds about what was and wasn't okay when leaving items on the curb. Those who know it's wrong thought it was very unlikely that they would be caught, so it was considered a very easy thing with very few consequences. Neighbours were very unlikely to report others for dumping, and I'll go into that in more detail. Dumping often happens when residents move house, so we found that that was a really key trigger moment for this type of behaviour. And real estate agents were really invested in preventing dumping. Strata managers felt that there was very little benefit for them in engaging, whereas real estate agents found a really direct benefit to themselves. So finding 1, now we'll dive a bit more into the detail of this. Normal, free, easy and positive. So putting out items on the curb was very, very normal. Most people had done it at some point. So it was seen as a standard thing that you did that was socially acceptable. There was very few negative connotations around it at all. Collection services seem to have played a part in creating this social norm. So there was a lot of factors around it, but collection services seem to be a very significant part of forming that habit of placing items on the curb. And really, when you dig down into it, it's free and it's the easiest behaviour available. You can just take your couch out, put it on the street, extremely low time investment, and it's free. You couldn't get a behaviour with less barriers. And putting out reusable items for others to take was seen as both environmentally and socially positive. So people felt very good when they put things out on the street. They thought, I'm giving this item to someone else who can then use it. It's not going to landfill. I feel like I've contributed to environmental and social goals. So people who are pro-environment are also pro-curbside. And the curb is also one of the first places people think of when disposing of items. So it's become very, very high in people's consideration sets. And this is actually, we think, motivated by how high people's knowledge was of collection services. People really knew what their collection services available were, how to get in touch with them, how to order them, how to get involved. And that really high level of knowledge had also led to a really high level of thinking, curb, that's where I should take that. So when we did our quantitative research on curbside dumping in 2014, curbside dumping was actually very high up in our behaviour list. And as you can see, there's this real ambiguity. So there was a real divide between what people decided was dumping, which was things like disposing of waste on public land, placing it on the road, putting it on someone else's land, that were very clearly identified as illegal dumping and unacceptable. Curbside, people were very, very unclear. Was it dumping? Was it not dumping? Was it okay? Was it not okay? So a lot of people said, yeah, I've definitely put items on the curb, with a real lack of clarity about, well, I put it part of a collection service, or I just put it out there and that's okay. So there was some complexity in there that we wanted to unpick. So here you can see the tiers of the way people thought about disposing of their bulky items. The first one was the normal bins where you put your garbage. The second one was council bulky waste collections. They were right up there. There's really high level of knowledge of them. And then leaving items on the curb outside a collection, very, very high. And then selling or giving away items online. But the barriers to that behaviour seem to be around convenience and time. And then there was the tip, which was really, you can see that real drop into the next tier, where people also putting it in other people's bins or putting it in public waste bins. So people really didn't think about the tip as an option. The only people we had that related to the tip as a legitimate option where they took bulky waste were tradespeople who already used it as part of their job. So people aren't thinking about the tip as a place that you go for waste, as household waste, personal waste. So, in summary, it's free and easy and instant. So here's some quotes from the research. So people's experience of curbside was, I put out a vacuum cleaner, I went back, bam, the vacuum cleaner's gone. I put out an exercise, like 2 minutes later, bam, it's gone. That was their experience. So it was all very, very positive. Doesn't require a vehicle or a trailer. Doesn't require storage space. So this was a major issue for people who were living in unit blocks, because they said as soon as they generated the item, they had nowhere to put it. Scheduled collection wasn't going to work for them. Book collections took up to 2 weeks or longer in different situations, and they hadn't planned what to do with it, so they put it on the street and they had nowhere else to put it. No additional effort required. People reported being very time poor, which was some of the barriers to selling it online or donating to charity. And they felt it went to a good home. So here's another quote from the research, that it was actually seen as an act of goodwill. So people were actually quite reluctant to put things out for council collections because they felt that it would go to a landfill. And there was also a lot of sentimentality and nostalgia associated with items that people often had, so they actually didn't want it to go to a landfill. The emotions around putting out those objects were quite complicated, so for them, putting it out on the curb for someone else to take, again, bumped up in that priority list. No collections. So it appears that collections have played a role in creating this social norm of normalising placing items on the curb. So the work that we did with councils in areas that didn't run curbside collections, they reported that curbside dumping was not a major issue for them. Other dumping definitely was. So dumping in bushland, dumping in parks, dumping in different areas, definitely higher on their priority list of illegal dumping issues. But they reported that curbside was not part of that. Councils with collections did very much prioritise this as an issue, experiencing residents putting out items out days or weeks before a collection, adding to piles, leaving items on the curb completely disassociated from a collection. So this behaviour was very much institutionalised and normalised in areas with collections, not so much without. Is it reusable? Then it's okay for the curb. So here we also start to come into the ambiguity space. So people felt very clearly that if it was reusable, I should put it on the curb. If it was rubbish, I shouldn't. But one of the complexities in this was everyone's definition of what was reusable. extremely different. So we had people who were saying, oh, you know, it's a fridge, it's a bit broken. It's like, man, but it's fixable. You could reuse that. I could put that out. And other people who would sit there and go, excuse me, I feel that that is rubbish and you've placed it on the street. This is not acceptable. So, but people did feel that putting items, things like garbage bags full of things that you would put in the red bin, definitely unacceptable. So there was some clear divides, but that ambiguity really escalated into what was reusable and what was not. Which ties into the next finding. So what is acceptable is unclear. Residents felt that there were very few visual cues to show what was and wasn't okay. So when they were seeing items on the curb, they couldn't tell if it was a collection or if it was illegal dumping or if this was an okay behaviour. And what they were seeing was the waste goes out onto the curb and then it disappears. So this must be okay. That was their experience. So there was very few people had seen things like investigation tape around incidents. There was some complexity around that as we unpicked that. So it wasn't easy for people to understand what was the right thing to do for those who did want to do the right thing. Again, they didn't think that putting out reusable items was unacceptable. They thought even if it wasn't acceptable, there was a grace period. Most people just assumed that if I put something out for about 10 days, council will turn a blind eye. Even if it's not okay, it'll be fine. There was a lot of that reasoning around that. Most were not aware that there were any penalties. Something else interesting in this is when they did find out how much the penalties could be, there was a lot of outrage around feeling that what they had done was not necessarily it wasn't an appropriate penalty for what they saw as acceptable behaviour. So something to be careful of is how you apply those illegal dumping penalties in this space, because you very much could be entering that space of that pushback. This isn't fair. I put a couch on the street. This isn't a fair fine. So something to consider when developing programs. Enforcement is often invisible. So this plays back into that ambiguity about what's right and wrong. Most people had never seen any evidence of detection or punishment for this behaviour, so there was no direct feedback that this was or wasn't acceptable or unacceptable. Most had never seen signs or tapes. Many thought there was a grace period, and items often disappeared without explanation, and all of this reinforces the dumping behaviour. Finding 3. Being caught was seen as very unlikely. So it's one of those interesting dissonance things that came out in the research, was that people were like, oh, but it's okay. But then you'd have stories about people being, oh, but I actually take it out at night and I make sure no one's watching me and I make sure that no information about my address details is in the waste. So there was this real disassociation between, no, it's fine, and this may not be fine, and I'm going to take all steps to ensure that I'm not caught. So some very interesting stuff going on in there. So residents thought that few investigations are undertaken, that investigations were unlikely to lead to penalties, and this was very high among our residents of unit blocks because they thought it was extremely unlikely that they would be identified for their behaviour. And the people who had seen taped off sites felt that it was very unlikely that that would lead to any kind of consequences. There was no evidence of consequences, so the taping, as it had a lot of pluses associated with it and would definitely play a role going forward, but then there was that next level of, yeah, but nothing happens. So something to consider. And cases of curbside dumping were rarely reported in the media, so no experience of anecdotes either, so no stories about there being consequences for this behaviour entering people's personal spheres, which is of course a real driver for experiencing perceived risk of getting caught. There were no drivers in that space. Finding 4. Neighbours didn't want to report neighbours, and this was because many would feel hypocritical because almost everyone had undertaken this behaviour at some point. They didn't want to be hypocrites. They didn't want to be responsible for a neighbour receiving the fine. So once they found out what the fines were like, they didn't feel like that was appropriate, and they really didn't want to be responsible for dropping their neighbour into hot water. And they also felt that, again, this ambiguity, that they weren't sure when it was dumping or when it was a collection, and they definitely didn't want to report a neighbour for something that was a completely legitimate collection. So there's a lot of other factors that feed into this desire not to report. Dumping often happens when residents move. So this was a key pain point. So property managers felt that residents often forgot to arrange removal of items. And when we did the focus groups with residents, it was a very, very low priority. It was one of the last things people thought of when they were moving. They were really focused on booking movers, finding their next home, sorting out how to manage all of the other responsibilities that came with moving, and thinking about what to do with unwanted items was so low. And they were very, very focused on the items they wanted to take with them. And then this was compounded by they didn't anticipate waiting times for collection services. So even if they remembered and they called the night before they were moving and said, "Can I book a collection?" Yes, but it will come at an appropriate length of time after that booking. So then they'd put the items, they'd put the items out on the street, and then they would sit there for X period of time until that collection actually occurred. So compounding that again. Real estate agents want to prevent dumping. So because real estate agents had to deal with the ramifications of dumping for tenants, which created work and expense for them, they really did want to provide information on waste disposal to save themselves time and effort. Some of them were already doing this on their own bat, but they really wanted information from the EPA or from council that carried that real weight to provide on these topics at the right time. So they were very open to doing things like providing that type of information when they gave a lease or when they received notice to vacate or things like that. They were very open to engaging. The other note on that was strata managers weren't. So they saw it as an interesting space, but they didn't see enough benefits to themselves to put in the amount of time and effort. But also the thing to consider with this sample is that it is a small qualitative study. So that finding could have been the specific managers we spoke to. So at this point, we can definitely see the real drivers for real estate. I think strata may be a more complicated strata manager by manager experience. So it's definitely a space to look into further, but because we had this real positive go sign from real estate agents, that was the way that I think we'll go forward. Recommendations. So out of the research, the recommendations were to clearly define what is acceptable to change the norm, so give some really strong visual cues that residents could really see in terms of feedback out on the street when they see items in their day-to-day experience that told them what was and what was not okay. Encourage appropriate reuse or disposal, so finding ways to manage to bump up things like selling online or donating to charity or engaging a council collection service before you choose to put an item on the street, which is of course a very challenging space, but it was one of the recommendations. And increasing the perceived likelihood of being caught. So it's very much increased the perceived likelihood because of the complexity of issuing fines that may or may not be felt to fit appropriately the behaviour. So definitely a space to tread carefully, but increasing that sense that there is enforcement and that there is a chance of being caught was a recommendation. And ensuring services are optimised. So some of the things that came out particularly around multi-unit dwellings was that scheduled collections were a real challenge for those people in unit blocks, and that one of the issues was around timing and around access, but as you'll find out from the next set of presentations, there's a lot more complexity in there to be unpacked, but that was one of the recommendations. So the research is now available on the EPA website, so all you need to do is Google illegal dumping research New South Wales. You'll come up with a page. It's all there for you to download and refer to, and please use. So the EPA is now using this research to inform program design about where we go next in this space. And our main goal for these programs is to provide a series of good practice guides and resources to support council to address this issue. So that will be the next thing we go into in the next space. So any questions?